$40 for a piece of junk, the pawnshop owner said, barely looking up from his phone. Honestly, old-timer, I'd throw it in the dumpster if you didn't want it. The 76-year-old Marine standing at the counter said nothing. He just laid 2 crumpled 20s on the glass, picked up the corroded rifle barrel wrapped in an old shop rag, and walked out the door. 3 weeks later, that same pawnshop owner would see that rifle on the evening news, appraised at more than the value of his entire store, his house, and every car he'd ever owned combined. And the old man who bought it, he never came back to say, "I told you so." He didn't have to. If you believe that real knowledge and quiet dignity will always outshine loud ignorance, comment the word respect before we go any further. Earl Joseph Whitfield had been a United States Marine for 31 years. He enlisted in 1968, fresh out of a small farming town in central Tennessee, a place where people worked with their hands and measured a man by what he could build, fix, or endure. Earl was 17 when he signed his papers, lying about his age by 4 months because his father had told him that a man who waits for permission to serve his country doesn't deserve the freedom that country provides. Boot camp at Paris Island nearly broke him. He was 5'8", 140 pounds soaking wet, and the drill instructors took one look at him and figured he'd wash out before the second week. But Earl had something those drill instructors couldn't see on a scale or measure with a tape. He had patience. He had the kind of stubborn, quiet endurance that comes from growing up on a farm where the work never ends, and complaining about it never once made the work go away. He graduated boot camp in the top 5% of his class, and within 2 years he was deployed to Vietnam, where he served 2 combat tours as a rifleman with the 3rd Marine Division. He saw things in those jungles that he never talked about, not to his wife, not to his children, not to the therapist the VA tried to send him to decades later. Earl believed that some things a man carries alone, not because he's too proud to share the weight, but because sharing it would mean putting that weight on someone who didn't earn it, someone who didn't choose it, and that wasn't something Earl was willing to do. After Vietnam, Earl spent the next 2 decades moving through the ranks, serving in every capacity the Marine Corps asked of him. He became a weapons instructor at Quantico, where he taught young Marines how to strip, clean, assemble, and fire virtually every standard issue and captured firearm in the American military inventory. He could identify a weapon by the sound it made from 200 yards away. He could tell you the year a rifle was manufactured by the machining marks on its receiver. He could hold a rusted bolt in his hand and tell you what country made it, what conflict it was used in, and whether the soldier who carried it was trained or conscripted just by the wear patterns on the metal. This wasn't a hobby for Earl. This was a lifetime of professional discipline, institutional knowledge passed down from armourers and gunsmiths who had served in Korea and the Second World War, men who learned their craft not from textbooks, but from necessity, from keeping weapons functional in mud and snow and sand when a malfunction meant death. When Earl retired in 1999 as a Master Gunnery Sergeant, he had more institutional knowledge about military firearms than most museums. But nobody gave him a museum. Nobody gave him a television show or a consulting contract. They gave him a pension, a folded flag, a handshake, and a small house in Murfreesboro, Tennessee, where he lived quietly with his wife Dorothy until she passed in 2014. After that, Earl lived alone. The years after Dorothy's death were the hardest Earl had ever faced. Harder than boot camp, harder than Vietnam, harder than anything the Corps had thrown at him. He kept the house clean because that's what Dorothy would have expected. He mowed the lawn on Saturdays because that's what neighbours expected. He went to the VFW hall on Tuesday evenings because that's what his remaining friends expected. But inside, Earl was hollowing out. The structure that had defined his entire adult life, the Marine Corps, the marriage, the purpose, was gone, and in its place was a silence that no amount of routine could fill. He started visiting pawn shops and estate sales, not because he was looking for anything in particular, but because those places reminded him of the old supply depots and armories he'd spent his career in. There was something comforting about the randomness of it. Bins full of old tools, racks of forgotten guitars, cases of jewellery that once meant something to someone, shelves of electronics that had been state-of-the-art 10 years ago and were now worth less than the shelf they sat on. Earl liked the archaeology of it. He liked picking through the remnants of other people's lives and imagining the stories behind the objects. And occasionally, very occasionally, he'd find something that made his pulse quicken, something that the seller didn't understand, something that was worth far more than the price tag suggested, because the person selling it didn't have the knowledge to see what Earl could see. It was a Tuesday morning in late October when Earl walked into Garrison's Pawn and Trade, a cluttered, dimly lit shop on the commercial strip just south of the interstate. He'd been there a dozen times before. The owner, a man in his early 40s named Rick Garrison, was the kind of person who thought he knew everything about everything, and took visible pleasure in making sure everyone around him knew it too. Rick had inherited the shop from his father, who had built it from nothing over 30 years of honest work and fair dealing. Rick had none of his father's patience and none of his father's humility. He spent most of his time behind the counter watching videos on his phone, occasionally glancing up to size up whoever walked through the door and make a snap judgment about whether they were worth his time. When Earl walked in that morning, wearing his usual faded flannel shirt, worn khaki trousers, and a beat-up Marine Corps cap that had seen better decades, Rick glanced up, registered an old man who probably couldn't afford anything worth selling, and went back to his phone. Earl didn't mind. He wasn't there for conversation. He was there for the bins. Garrison's had a section in the back corner that Rick called the graveyard. It was where he threw anything he couldn't identify, couldn't sell, or couldn't be bothered to research. Old tools with missing handles, tarnished brass fittings, lengths of chain, broken clocks, and occasionally pieces of old firearms that had come in as part of estate lots or box purchases from auctions. Most of it was genuine junk, corroded beyond salvation, missing critical components, or so heavily modified that whatever historical value it might have once had was long gone. Earl always checked the graveyard. He checked it the way a prospector checks a creek bed, not expecting gold every time, but knowing that the one time you don't look is the time you miss it. On this particular Tuesday, something caught his eye. Sticking out of a bin labelled scrap metal $5 per pound, there was a barrel. It was heavily corroded, pitted along its length, with a greenish-brown patina that suggested it had been stored somewhere damp for a very long time. Most people would have seen exactly what Rick saw when he threw it in the bin, which was a piece of rusted pipe that vaguely resembled a gun barrel. But Earl wasn't most people. Earl saw the fluting. He saw the gas port placement. He saw the muzzle device, or what was left of it, and he felt something in his chest that he hadn't felt in years, a jolt of recognition so powerful that he had to steady himself against the edge of the bin. He reached in carefully, both hands, and lifted the piece out. It wasn't just a barrel. It was a barrel assembly still attached to a receiver, and the receiver, beneath the corrosion and the filth, had markings. Earl tilted it toward the overhead fluorescent light squinting through his bifocals, and his hands began to tremble. Not from age, not from weakness, from the kind of controlled adrenaline that a 31-year career of handling historic weapons had taught him to manage but never fully suppress. He could see stamped characters beneath the rust. He could see the outline of an eagle, and below it, a manufacturer's code that he had seen exactly twice before in his life, once in a classified reference manual at Quantico, and once in a photograph in a book about German airborne operations that had been out of print since 1982. What Earl was holding, what this pawn shop owner had thrown into a scrap metal bin and priced by the pound, was the receiver and barrel assembly of a Fallschirmjäger Gewehr 42, an FG-42, a German paratroop rifle designed and manufactured in extremely limited numbers during the Second World War, issued exclusively to the elite Fallschirmjäger airborne units of the Luftwaffe, and considered by military historians and firearms scholars to be one of the most innovative and rarest combat rifles ever produced. Fewer than 7,000 were ever made. Fewer than 200 were known to have been captured intact by Allied forces. And the number that still existed in any recognizable condition, even partial condition, could be counted on two hands with fingers left over. Earl carried the assembly to the front counter and set it down gently, the way you'd set down a newborn. Rick looked up from his phone, glanced at the corroded piece of metal and smirked. "Found something in the graveyard, huh?" he said. "That's been back there for months. Came in with a bunch of old farm equipment from an estate sale out near Shelbyville. I think the old guy who owned it was some kind of hoarder. His kids just wanted everything gone." Earl asked how much. Rick picked it up carelessly, turning it over in one hand like it was a piece of plumbing, and Earl had to physically restrain himself from reaching out and stopping him. "I mean, it's junk," Rick said. "There's no stock, no bolt, the barrel's shot. You couldn't fire this thing if your life depended on it. I was going to scrap it, honestly. Tell you what, $40 and it's yours. I'm doing you a favour." Earl said nothing. He reached into his wallet, pulled out two 20s, laid them flat on the glass counter and waited. Rick took the money, didn't offer a receipt, didn't offer a bag, and went back to his phone. Earl wrapped the assembly in the shop rag he always carried in his back pocket, held it against his chest like it was something sacred, and walked out of Garrison's Pawn and Trade without another word. The next 3 weeks of Earl's life were the most alive he had felt since Dorothy died. He converted the spare bedroom into a workshop, covering the floor with drop cloths and setting up a folding table under a pair of clamp-on work lights. He ordered specialized supplies, penetrating oil, fine-grade brass brushes, cold bluing solution, a set of precision gunsmithing screwdrivers, and a reference book on German small arms manufacturing marks that cost him more than the rifle itself. Every morning he woke at 5, made coffee, and sat down at that table. He worked with the patience and precision that 3 decades in the Marine Corps had forged into his bones. The first week was devoted entirely to cleaning. He soaked the receiver in penetrating oil for 48 hours, then began the painstaking process of removing corrosion with brass picks and brushes, working millimetre by millimetre, terrified of damaging the stampings underneath. When the manufacturer's marks finally emerged clean and legible, Earl sat back in his chair and stared at them for a full 10 minutes without moving. Krieghoff. The receiver was stamped with the Krieghoff manufacturer's code, confirming that this was a second type FG-42, produced in late 1943 or early 1944 at the Heinrich Krieghoff factory in Suhl, Germany. The serial number was intact. The Waffenamt inspection proof marks were intact. The eagle and swastika acceptance stamps, though partially worn, were identifiable. Earl was holding a piece of history that most museums would never have the opportunity to display. The second week, he focused on the barrel. The exterior pitting was extensive but largely cosmetic. The bore itself, once Earl managed to run a cleaning rod through it, was in far better condition than the outside suggested. The rifling was still sharp, the chamber was clean, and there was no evidence of catastrophic pressure damage or improper ammunition use. This rifle had been fired, certainly, but it had not been abused. Someone, probably the original German paratrooper who carried it, had maintained this weapon with professional care. The corrosion was environmental, the result of decades of improper storage, not battlefield neglect. Earl reblued the barrel using a cold process that preserved the original dimensions and markings, while restoring a deep, even finish that would have made the Krieghoff factory engineers proud. The third week he turned his attention to the missing components. The stock, the bolt assembly, and the trigger group were all absent. Earl knew he couldn't fabricate original parts, and he wouldn't insult the weapon by installing reproductions without clearly marking them as such. Instead, he sourced a period-correct replacement stock from a military antiques dealer in Pennsylvania, a man he'd known for 20 years through the collecting community, who happened to have an original FG-42 buttstock that had been separated from its rifle decades ago. The wood was worn but solid, the metal butt plate still bearing its original finish. Earl fitted it by hand, working the inletting with chisels and sandpaper until the fit was tight and true, the way the Krieghoff craftsman would have done it. He didn't have a bolt or trigger group, but what he had, a complete barreled receiver with an original stock, was more than enough to establish the rifle's identity, provenance, and extraordinary historical significance. When the restoration was complete, Earl did something he had never done before. He called someone for help, not because he couldn't identify what he had. He knew exactly what he had, but because he wanted documentation, official documentation, the kind that would stand up to scrutiny from collectors, museums, and historians. He called Martin Hale, a retired Army Lieutenant Colonel who had spent the second half of his career as a military firearms appraiser for the Department of Defense, cataloguing captured enemy weapons for the Army's historical collections. Martin had appraised weapons for the Smithsonian, the National World War II Museum in New Orleans, and half a dozen major private collections. Earl had met him at a firearms symposium in Virginia in 2004, and they had stayed in touch over the years, exchanging occasional emails about interesting finds and historical footnotes. When Earl described what he had, there was a long silence on the other end of the phone. Then Martin said very quietly, "Earl, don't let that out of your sight. I'm coming to you." Martin drove from his home in Northern Virginia to Murfreesboro, Tennessee, a trip of nearly 8 hours, without stopping for anything except gas. He arrived at Earl's house at 11 o'clock at night, and Earl was waiting for him on the front porch with 2 cups of coffee. They didn't shake hands. Martin looked at Earl, looked at the coffee and said, "Show me." Earl led him inside. The examination took 3 hours. Martin used a jeweler's loupe, a digital caliper, ultraviolet light, and a reference database on his laptop that contained serial number records, factory production logs, and known surviving examples of the FG-42. He measured bore dimensions, checked headspace markings, compared the Waffenamt stamps against authenticated examples, and cross-referenced the serial number against every known registry of captured German weapons in American, British and French military archives. At 2 a.m, Martin set down his loupe, closed his laptop and sat in silence for a long moment. Then he looked at Earl and said, "This is real. This is a Krieghoff second type FG-42, serial number in the 4000 range, manufactured in Suhl between October and December of 1943. It matches production records from the Krieghoff factory that were captured by American forces in April 1945. Based on the serial number and the unit markings on the receiver, this rifle was likely issued to the 1st Fallschirmjäger Division, which fought in Italy, Normandy, and the Battle of the Bulge. There are currently 187 documented surviving FG-42 rifles in all conditions worldwide. Of those, fewer than 40 are in private hands. Of those 40, fewer than 15 have matching serial numbers on barrel and receiver, with original Waffenamt proofs intact. Earl, what you pulled out of that scrap metal bin is worth, conservatively, between $250,000 and $350,000. At auction, with proper provenance documentation and the restoration work you've done, it could exceed $400,000. Earl didn't say anything for a long time. He sat in his chair, looking at the rifle resting on the workbench under the glow of the clamp lights, and he thought about Dorothy. He thought about what she would say if she were sitting next to him. She would probably laugh. She would probably say, "Earl Joseph Whitfield, you have been dragging home old junk from those shops for 10 years and I have not said one word, and now you're telling me one of those pieces of junk is worth more than this house?" And Earl would have said, "Yes, Ma'am." And she would have shaken her head and smiled the way she always did when Earl proved that his quiet certainty was worth more than anyone else's loud opinion. The story didn't stay quiet for long. Martin filed the appraisal with the American Society of Arms Collectors and flagged the discovery with the National World War II Museum, which immediately expressed interest in acquiring the rifle for their permanent collection. A reporter from the local Murfreesboro paper picked up the story, and within a week it had been syndicated nationally. The headline read, "Retired Marine finds $300,000 World War II rifle in pawnshop scrap bin." The story went everywhere. Cable news, firearms forums, military history websites, veteran community pages. Earl's phone rang so many times he finally unplugged it. People showed up at his door, collectors, reporters, curiosity seekers, and Earl turned them all away politely but firmly. He wasn't interested in fame. He wasn't interested in being a spectacle. He had found something extraordinary, and he had recognized it because he had spent his entire life building the knowledge to do so, and that was the end of it as far as he was concerned. But the part of the story that people talked about most wasn't the rifle. It wasn't the appraisal value. It wasn't even the remarkable coincidence of a man with exactly the right expertise walking into exactly the right pawn shop on exactly the right day. The part people talked about most was Rick Garrison. Rick saw the news story 3 days after it aired. Someone sent him a link and he watched it on his phone behind the counter of his own shop. The same counter where he had taken Earl's $40 and told him he was doing him a favour. The video showed Earl sitting in his living room, the restored rifle displayed on a padded rack behind him, while Martin Hale explained to the reporter exactly what it was and exactly what it was worth. Rick watched the entire segment without moving. Then he closed his phone, walked to the back of the shop and stood in front of the graveyard bin for a long time. He thought about his father, who had built this business by knowing the value of things, by taking the time to learn, by treating every person who walked through the door as someone who might know something he didn't. Rick had inherited the shop, but he hadn't inherited the discipline. He hadn't inherited the humility. He had looked at an old man in a faded cap and seen someone who wasn't worth his attention, and he had looked at a piece of history and seen scrap metal, and in both cases he had been catastrophically, humiliatingly wrong. To his credit, Rick did something that most people in his position wouldn't have done. He didn't call a lawyer. He didn't claim the sale was fraudulent. He didn't go on social media to defend himself or make excuses. He drove to Earl's house, knocked on the door, and when Earl answered, Rick said, "Sir, I owe you an apology, not for the price. That was a fair deal, and you earned it. I owe you an apology for how I treated you. My father would have known what that rifle was. My father would have treated you with the respect you deserved the second you walked in. I didn't do either of those things, and I'm sorry." Earl looked at him for a moment, then opened the door wider and said, "Come in, son. I just made coffee." They sat at Earl's kitchen table for 2 hours. Earl told Rick about the rifle's history, about the Fallschirmjäger and the battles they fought, about the engineering brilliance of the FG-42 design, about the Krieghoff factory and the skilled workers who built these weapons under increasingly desperate wartime conditions. He told Rick about his own career, about Vietnam and Quantico, about the decades he spent learning to read metal the way other people read books, and Rick listened. He listened the way his father had always tried to teach him to listen, with his mouth closed and his mind open. When Earl was finished, Rick asked if there was anything he could do. Earl thought about it for a moment and said, "Learn. That's what your father would have wanted. Learn what you're selling. Learn who you're selling it to. Every person who walks into your shop has a story, and every object in your shop has a story. And if you don't take the time to learn those stories, you'll spend your whole life selling things for a fraction of what they're worth to people who know more than you do." Rick nodded. He shook Earl's hand, and he left. Over the following months, Rick enrolled in an online course in antiques appraisal. He started attending estate sales with a notebook instead of just a checkbook. He reorganized his shop, got rid of the graveyard bin, and replaced it with a research station where he could photograph and identify unknown items before pricing them. He put a sign above the counter that read, "Everything has a story. Ask us." It was, in its own quiet way, the most expensive lesson a $40 rifle had ever taught. Earl eventually sold the FG-42 to the National World War II Museum in New Orleans for a sum that he never publicly disclosed, but that Martin Hale later described as appropriate to the significance of the piece. The museum gave the rifle a dedicated display case in their firearms gallery, with a placard that read, "FG-42 paratroop rifle, Type 2, Krieghoff manufacture, circa 1943, recovered and restored by Master Gunnery Sergeant Earl J. Whitfield, USMC, retired, Murfreesboro, Tennessee." Earl drove down to New Orleans for the installation ceremony. He wore his dress blues for the first time in over 20 years. They still fit, which surprised no one who knew him. He stood in front of that display case with his hands clasped behind his back, perfectly still, perfectly straight, and he looked at the rifle that he had pulled from a scrap metal bin and brought back to life with his own hands, and for just a moment, anyone watching could see something in his eyes that went beyond pride. It was the look of a man who had spent his entire life being underestimated, and who had never once let that change what he knew about himself. The museum director shook his hand and said, "Sergeant Whitfield, on behalf of this institution, and everyone who will ever learn from this exhibit, thank you for your service and your knowledge." Earl nodded once, the way Marines do, and said, "It was my honour." He drove back to Murfreesboro that evening, stopped at a gas station for coffee, and was home before midnight. The next morning he woke at 5, made his coffee, and drove to an estate sale in Woodbury, 20 miles east of town. There was a box lot of old tools and metal parts listed in the catalogue. Earl figured it was worth a look. Some people go their whole lives without ever being seen for what they truly are. They walk through the world carrying knowledge, experience and dignity that the people around them never bother to notice because they're too busy looking at the surface. Earl Whitfield spent 76 years proving that the surface is the least important part of anything, whether it's a man or a rifle. The rust doesn't tell you what's underneath. The corrosion doesn't tell you what the metal once was or what it can be again. Only someone with the patience to look deeper, to strip away the decay and read the markings hidden beneath, can understand the true value of what they're holding. That's not just a lesson about antique firearms. That's a lesson about human beings. Every veteran who ever put on a uniform and came home to a world that didn't recognize what they'd done. Every old man or old woman who walks into a room and gets dismissed because of their age or their appearance. Every person who carries something extraordinary inside them that the world refuses to see, they are the FG-42 in the scrap bin. They are the $300,000 treasure labelled as junk. And the only question that matters is whether you're the kind of person who takes the time to look closer, or the kind who sells it for $40 and goes back to your phone. If this story reminded you that respect isn't given based on what someone looks like, but on what they carry inside, then subscribe to this channel. We tell stories about the people the world overlooks, the quiet ones, the old ones, the ones who don't ask for attention but who deserve every bit of it. Subscribe, share this with someone who needs to hear it, and we'll see you in the next one.